Shall we talk about COVID? What do you think?
Yeah, let's do it, dude. Now's the time.
Now's the time. All right. So
wait. I got a text from Tim. It's 2 COVID tests. You're texting me and Sokka. I think we can say that.
Yeah.
And it's two COVID tests, and it's like they're both like clear red lined, and you're like, I mean, you didn't say fuck, but you were just like, shit, like this happened.
Here we go.
What was the first, like, walk me through it? Like, you just woke up one morning and was like, I just don't feel right, or what happened?
Yeah, I'll walk you through it. So this is about 2.5 weeks ago now, I want to say, something like that. And it was, if I look back, as you know, I've been very, very careful.
So careful.
Began tracking COVID end of January, beginning of February 2020. Put up a blog post, which was very moderate, super moderate. And ultimately, in the subsequent weeks, encouraged South by Southwest to cancel, and was kind of dragged over the coals at the time. And then, of course, COVID turned into what COVID turned into, and have been very careful. Not because I assume that it is instantaneous death. That is not what I assume, but because I have pre-existing respiratory issues, very well-established respiratory issues, and there were a lot of unknowns. There continue to be a lot of unknowns related to COVID-19. And I wanted to delay getting it as long as possible. And looking at the lifestyle calculus, it was very easy for me to mitigate risk without making huge sacrifices. So I saw a lot of potential upside and very limited downside to taking certain precautions. I ended up going to F1, so Formula One in Austin, where at least in the paddock, everyone had been, I believe, both vaccinated and tested negative with a PCR test within 48 or 72 hours. Where I think I contracted it because there's so few options, because I've been so careful. There's so few options where I would have been exposed. What I think happened is I succumbed to social pressure. And the way it happened is I had taken a car by myself to and from Circuit of the Americas, from COTA, each day. And then on the last day, getting back, I had made some mistake, and there was a snafu with transportation. And so I ended up getting kind of directed to a location, to transportation, which I assumed meant I would be able to get a one-on-one ride back to the city, since trying to find parking is just impossible. I mean, there were 400,000 people there over 3 days. So I end up in a golf cart, driven like a half a mile to this point. It's complete pandemonium, right? Like everyone is trying to leave COTA at the same time. And I get directed to this van, and it's like, there's your ride. Now, I had taken a van to the event that day, but I was one of 3 people in the van, and we spaced out and so on. And I also had a mask. On the way back, I opened the door of the van, and it's packed. Right? It's like a 12-seater with 12 people or 11 people so that I could fit in. And they're like, okay, yeah, hop on in. We're headed downtown. And I was like, oh, fuck. I don't want to do this. But at least where I was, everyone was tested. Fuck. Whatever. And then I got in. And I sat down, and it's like there was this one like model chick vaping in the fucking van. I mean, it was terrible. And I'm just sitting there like reading my Kindle. I'm like, if I'm going to get fucking COVID, it is going to be right now here. And then about 5 days later, started feeling very, very congested, and began to develop a really severe headache. And I attributed it to allergies in Austin, because Austin has really, really bad allergies. You have cedar or juniper ash, you have ragweed, you have all sorts of allergens that cause really severe reactions in people. So I just assumed it was allergies. And then I was getting ready to pack to get on a flight to go to New Orleans for a friend's 50th birthday and Halloween. And we were by basically my request, everyone was going to be PCR tested when they landed. And we had, my girlfriend and I, Binax kits at home. So we had Abbott manufactured rapid antigen tests at home. And I was feeling congested. And so she very wisely suggested, well, before we get on the plane and pack and do all this stuff, why don't you take one before we go? And I did, just as a formality, right? Kept packing, And I came back and I'm like, oh shit, that looks positive.
Oh shit.
And I don't know what the accuracy, there are different ways to assess these tests, but let's just say that it's 85% accurate. And Peter Attia could give you a much better description, right?
Well, I think it's one of those things when it's if it has a positive, it's more likely to be positive, but it could miss. You know what I'm talking about? Like there's
right, I do. But also, if you just take 2 tests or 3 tests,
right,
you can get the likelihood of 2 false positives down to say less than 5%.
So let me ask you a question. The one thing I'm always curious about these things, because we've all done these at home, or at least a few of us have that are listening. How quickly did that other line show up? I always wonder.
Within 5 minutes, it showed up so quickly.
Oh, so it wasn't like what? Because I was like, wait 15 minutes, and I'm always waiting.
It popped up really quickly, and then did the second test, and it popped up really quickly, and I was like, well, this looks like a positive. And at that point, went immediately into action mode. I didn't panic at that point. I'm very good in crisis, or I should say, and some people listening might say, well, that's not a crisis. Well, if you knew my history and you knew some of the outcomes that I've seen and the doctors I've interacted with, you wouldn't be as cavalier. But
what is action mode for you? What does that mean, action mode?
Yeah, I'll tell you, but I'll just say, like, in crisis situations, it's like the little paper cuts of life on a daily basis that make me lose my shit. But like, if there's like a car accident, or someone is in the hospital, or something really bad happens, I'm good in those circumstances, right? Like the freeze in Austin and doing disaster response, and like I'm really good in those circumstances. So what action mode meant for me was, number one, immediately scheduling a PCR test to definitively confirm that I was positive.
But you knew you'd taken like 3 of these things. Like
no, I'd taken 2 at that point, but before, and actually this is important. So before considering different types of actions or interventions, I wanted to really, to the extent that I could be close to 100% certain, be 100% certain. Because, as you know, one doctor I know well puts it, not Peter, another doctor, he says, you know, drugs are all terrible with a few positive side effects. Meaning, like you're signing up for a targeted effect that you're hoping will be helpful or beneficial, but almost all drugs have known and or unknown side effects. It's just part and parcel. Very few things are so selective that it's all upside. So I wanted to be as certain as possible. So PCR test, and then as soon as that was confirmed, sort of simultaneously scheduling, because I could cancel. Let me just pause for a second and say, none of this is medical advice. This is very specific to me. It's very specific to conversations with my doctors, but I want to, for educational purposes only, walk through this so that people can, if it's helpful, have some view into my thought process. So I booked IV monoclonal antibodies, which are from Regeneron in this case.
Question as this is unfolding. Where you're based, you were in Austin at the time, is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, so is that something you could just book? I didn't even know you could just like book, or do you have to have a doctor go and like how hard is it to get that?
There is a company called Drip Hydration, driphydration.com. And my girlfriend booked the monoclonal antibodies through Drip Hydration. And the way that works is you effectively sign up, and then you will be, and I'm probably getting some of the details wrong here, but you will be contacted by a doctor or nurse practitioner who does an intake evaluation. Because there are risks with almost anything that is an unfamiliar compound. You can experience anaphylactic response, right? You could have anaphylactic shock and you could die. So there are people who have adverse events with monoclonal antibodies. And as I'm also going into action mode, I'm talking to 3 different doctors, right? And it gives me tremendous sympathy every time I have a situation like this or some type of acute medical situation, how challenging it is to navigate medicine and science, even if you are really plugged in. So I was in contact, I'm not going to name names, but I was in touch with 3 doctors, all very good doctors. One effectively said, do monoclonal antibodies as quickly as you can, because the sooner you do it, the better. My understanding is generally you want to administer within 7 days of contracting. But keep in mind, I don't know when I contracted exactly. It was probably 5 days before I was diagnosed. The second person said, I don't think you fit the risk profile. You are not immune compromised from sort of a textbook assessment.
You're double vaxxed, right?
You're double vaccinated, in my case with Moderna. There are possible downsides to having the monoclonal antibodies administered. I would advise against taking it, and you should wait and see. And if you develop more severe symptoms, then we can talk. The third doctor gave me the pros and cons, and this is a very common response that you'll get, gave me the pros and cons and said, really, it's up to you, right? I could justify saying go. I could justify saying don't go. That's a very challenging situation to be in, right? Because there is no tiebreaker in this case.
Can I ask you how you got 3 doctors? Are these like pre-existing doctors that you've worked with in the past? Just
pre-existing doctors.
Okay, I know you know a lot of doctors. I just was wondering, you're calling up people randomly or?
Right, 1-800-COVID doctors.
Yeah.
I am not calling up people randomly. I, as you know, Kevin, really believe in redundancy and backup.
Yeah.
And I have 2 backup whole house generators at my house, which meant I was one of 2 houses in an entire neighborhood with power during the Austin freeze last winter. You know, my feeling, and this is from the military, not that I was in the military, but a lot of my friends who have been in the military will say 2 is 1 and 1 is none. Like if you have 2 of something, you're going to lose 1 of them and then you'll have 1. If you have 1, just consider it none, right? Because doctors get sick. Sometimes doctors are unavailable. I'm not in a near fatal car crash, right? So it may not even qualify as an emergency for some doctors. And for that reason, I want to have multiple people sort of on contract or multiple people I've already done intake with, who I have relationships with, who I can contact via cell phone, right? That's just, if I'm going to spend excess money anywhere for redundancy, medical is where to spend it. Right? For you and your loved ones. So that's how I had 3 people. And I was doing this via email and also via cell phone. And I spoke with all of them. And they're all great. But the point is, there was no consensus. I ended up, for psychological reasons, deciding that I wanted to do it because of some of my pre-existing conditions. I did not want to wonder whether or not I was going to develop some type of respiratory distress or collapse. I didn't want to have that on my mind for the next 5 days. I knew that if I had an anaphylactic response, there are ways to kind of attenuate that response with, say, an EpiPen or intravenous, I think it's diphenhydramine, Benadryl. So there are ways to kind of mitigate the risk. So I decided to do monoclonal antibodies, and then also decided through the advice of 2 out of 3 doctors in this case, to take fluvoxamine. So I started taking something called fluvoxamine, which is a repurposed antidepressant. This is a very interesting case. So fluvoxamine, and I'm reading here from nature.com, so I would expect it to be credible and fact-checked, but obviously do your own homework and please always speak to any doctor before stopping or starting any medications. So common antidepressant slashes risk of COVID death. So fluvoxamine, not to be confused with Prozac, which is, I think, fluoxetine. It has a very similar name, but it's different. So fluvoxamine is a different antidepressant that is cheap, widely available, and frequently used for depression and obsessive compulsive disorder. So also I was like, I'm kind of curious to see what this will do to me.
Yeah, win-win.
Yeah, win-win. But I'll just read briefly so that people have an idea of why this has been repurposed. So it is also known to dampen immune responses and temper tissue damage, and researchers credit these properties with its success in a recent trial. Among study participants who took the drug as directed and did so in the early stages of the disease, COVID-19 related deaths fell by roughly 90%, and the need for intensive COVID-19 related medical care fell by roughly 65%. Now, I should, however, also read the quote from a scientist at Emory University School of Medicine in Atlanta who says, a major victory for drug repurposing, but next, quote, fluvoxamine treatment should be adopted for those at high risk for deterioration who are not vaccinated or cannot receive monoclonal antibodies. So one could make the argument, and one of my doctors did make the argument, that A, you're not at a high risk of deterioration. B, you're vaccinated. C, you're getting monoclonal antibodies. You do not need to take fluvoxamine.
So you took the kitchen sink approach, basically.
I didn't, though.
You didn't do the horsey, but you went almost horse.
I didn't do the horsey. I didn't go full horse. I chose 2 interventions. And then I supplemented with vitamin D and a handful of other supplements that are very low risk, right? I also supplemented with baby aspirin for any type of like thrombosis risk. And so one could make the argument that this is complete overkill, right? But for me, in my mind, as I'm tracking outcomes, and I've tracked this since February, and I'm not crazy. I don't think I'm crazy. Like, I think I'm actually
I think I would have done the exact same thing, by the way, based on everything that I've read. I think my protocol would have been the same.
Yeah. I don't think I've been crazy about this stuff. I think, my paying attention to this early allowed me to make some of the best investment decisions of my life. So even if you think I'm a crank when it comes to the science, like understanding the societal and supply chain implications of this is useful. So that is what I did. And I'll just add a few things. So what happened, right? What happened? I ended up having, I would say, overall mild symptoms.
Well, what was the text you sent me where you said you woke up in the middle of the night with a little bit of a panic? What was going on there with the chest stuff?
So there were a number of kind of events that were very disconcerting. So, but when people ask me like 0 to 10, how bad was your COVID? And I was like, well, people die from this. So if dying is 10, like I'm not a 7. Like I have to assume that if it's like a 7 or above, you're in the hospital. So 4, 5, perhaps, I don't know. And I had mild fever. I had severe headache, and very bizarrely, like a localized headache that felt kind of like an ice pick in the side of the head.
Ooh, I hate those. Which
was unpleasant. I had extreme muscle soreness to the extent that it was hard to move at all. But the most disconcerting, those are all, say, severe flu symptoms, let's call it.
Yeah. It's the lung shit that scares you though, right?
It was the respiratory distress and labored breathing, like tightness in the chest and having difficulty breathing. That was the most disconcerting for me by far.
And that was just one night?
That was a few different nights. And also it's very difficult to determine causality, what causes what, right? Because so many things are happening simultaneously. So as an example, when I started to wean off of the SSRIs, because I've never been on SSRIs before, and I also spoke to a number of doctors. A few were like, you don't need to taper off, you can stop cold turkey because it's only 10 days. And then I spoke to a few other psychiatrists who I trust very deeply, and they said, absolutely don't stop cold turkey. And I tapered off. So I taper off of the SSRIs. This is maybe 5 days ago. So let's just call it 2 weeks post, although I took the fluvoxamine at full dose for 10 days and then tapered off over, say, 3 or 4. Talk to your doctor. Don't just do what I did. What I noticed was each night, as I started tapering off, I would wake up at between 4 or 5 in the morning with really rapid heart rate and sweating profusely.
Crazy.
Now, it happened once. Who knows what it's from?
That can't be the SSRI though. That's got to be just COVID.
Well, hold on. So it could be anything, right? Or it could be any number of things. But then it happened the next night, and then it happened the third night. I'm like, okay, something's happening. But, is it from COVID? Is it from the SSRIs in some capacity? It could be. Like, there's a chance that is it.
It might be from the lack of SSRIs, right?
Well,
like
that's
your body
the other
being
thing.
Like,
is it because I'm experiencing a rebound inflammatory response from removing these SSRIs that have an anti-inflammatory effect? I don't know. So I'm about now 2.5 weeks out. I did my first workout last night and have had a splitting headache since. Within a few minutes of starting exercise, my heart rate spiked to 150, 160 beats per minute.
wow, crazy.
One of the most consistent.
That's high, dude.
It was, yeah.
Doing what?
Doing nothing. I mean, getting on a stationary bike for 5 minutes to warm up.
Wow.
I will say the fatigue and extended fatigue and ease of fatigue has been the most noticeable, persistent effect. And I remember also the symptoms coming in waves. Maybe at day 5, I really was just going stir crazy. I wanted to go outside for a walk, mask on, away from other people, late at night. And I ended up going for my first walk, not that night, but the next kind of late afternoon, off hours. And I went for a walk in downtown Austin, not near anybody, way outside of any congestion, for a half hour, really slowly, flat ground. And I came back and I was so tired that I fell asleep for 4 hours.
Wow.
Yeah. So I'm glad I took the precautions I did. And I will say this and I've probably lost people who are, you probably lost some people already just listening to my recounting of this, but the purpose of the vaccine, because I saw a number of comments when I put up a notice just saying I've contracted COVID. Anyone who's waiting for anything from me, please just be patient because it could be a few weeks. When I put up that note on social, people lost their minds on every side in every direction. It's really disheartening to see. And it's not because I care personally, but it's become such a divisive issue. And what I'll say, just for me personally, I never expected the vaccine to prevent me from becoming infected. What I did hope for, and based on the data believed was likely, is that the vaccinations would, once I got COVID, would reduce the risk of being hospitalized or having severe complications, including long haul symptoms, even if your initial symptoms are mild. So I just think that's really important to say, because a lot of the responses I saw were, oh, you think you're so fucking smart. Like, doesn't seem like your vaccine is working. And it's like, well, guys, if less than 1%, and this is the number I've been told by a number of docs, so definitely check the primary materials, but if less than 1% of the people currently hospitalized are vaccinated, just based on the data, forget about the politicians, forget about all the yelling and screaming on YouTube, but just looking at the data we have, which are not all manufactured by Big Pharma. As someone who funds a lot of science, I just want to say, like, it's not that simple, right? Like the conspiracies on one side, which are like all of this is being driven by Big Pharma, have a grain of truth to them in the sense that, Big Pharma lobbies and has a lot of capital, and they can exert influence, but they don't have complete control over something like this. Similarly, on kind of the other end of the spectrum, you have people who are concerned about nanny states or police state and the US government inflicting this and forcing this upon people. I'm not talking about mandates, by the way. I'm putting that aside. That is just like outside of the purview of this conversation. But if we're talking about my personal reasons, I happen to still believe that good scientists exist and that the scientific method is the best approach we currently have for asking questions of nature and getting back verifiable, repeatable answers. And I was vaccinated to keep the symptoms as mild as they happen to be for me. And I'm not convinced that that would have been the case otherwise.
Yeah.
Given that, when things were hitting New York, I was on the phone talking to doctors at Mount Sinai and other places, senior attending physicians who were telling me on the phone, if you hear people telling you that this is just affecting people who are 70 and 80, don't believe them, because I'm looking in front of me at like 2 or 3 people in their 20s and 30s who are intubated, and they have no pre-existing symptoms or comorbidities. None of them smoke. Like, you got to be careful with this stuff. So that is my story.